So we were looking at chapter 7 of Gide's novel Strait is the Gate. Elisa had quoted from 12th night that strain again, it is a dying fall, which ends with, it is not so sweet now as it was before. So as this stanza talks about about the mood changes in a lover, but it also suggests some kind of a saturation in love or saturation in pleasure or in music, so any kind of pleasure which might be saturated at some point and then it is not so pleasant anymore. And if we think that Elisa is talking about her own affair with Jerome, then will not be very wrong, because Elisa is more and more getting alienated from this love with Jerome, as she constantly imagines a superior love which is heavenly, love for God. And this is a situation which Jerome comes to understand with much grief. He gradually comes to understand. So we ended where they said that it did not suffice, it would not be happiness. So the happiness expected in spiritual love, that must be the target, and the happiness in worldly love should not suffice, should not be enough. And at the end of the letter, though Elisa says, goodbye my friend, hic incipit amor Dei, will you ever know how much I love you? So she ends with asserting her love for Jerome. In the same breath, she says that here begins the love for God. So apparently there is a contradiction here which she does not want to recognize. And naturally Jerome is extremely confused and cannot ascertain what is Elisa's true attitude towards him. So he feels that he is defenseless against the snare of virtue. That is, he cannot compete with virtue, the love that a worldly lover can offer. It cannot compete with the idea of virtue, and virtue appears to him therefore as a snare, and in this snare or trap the two lovers here are trapped. They find themselves trapped. All heroism attracted and dazzled me, for I could not separate it from love. Elisa's letter inspired me with a rash and intoxicating enthusiasm. God knows that I strove after more virtue only for her sake. Now enthusiasm, interestingly or incidentally, also is the word for what Puritans or extremely religious people consider as an inspiration by God. So this intoxicating enthusiasm, that is the intoxicating desire for God, that is also described by Jerome as rash, because it is a refusal of all worldly desires. But this kind of spiritual desire also has some kind of an intoxication of its own, and people who subscribe to such emotions, they become intoxicated by the idea of spiritual, experience. And Jerome thought that was heroism of some kind, but actually he was falling more and more into the snare of this rash attraction. But he also knew that he was attracted towards spirituality because of Elisa. Then he tried to reply. He says, "Alas, I didn't suspect the subtlety of her feint, and little imagined that it would be by a height where there was room for only one, that she might escape me once more." These words are very deep because they can be understood only with hind knowledge, only after knowing that this was a feint by Elisa. That is, she acted before Jerome as if she were much more attracted towards spiritual love than physical love, which was not true. That became clear to Jerome only after reading her diaries after her death. But at this moment, Jerome naively believed in Elisa's, presentation, and he didn't have any idea that by this presentation, Elisa would escape him, since she had represented that the gate of heaven is too narrow to allow two people. Then he wrote to Elisa that holiness was his choice because of her. And to this Elisa replied, "But my friend, holiness is not a choice, it is an obligation." And the word was underlined 3 times in a letter. If you are what I take you to be, you will not be able to evade it either. If you are what I take you to be. So Elisa believed Jerome to be a saint. And if Jerome is really like that, then he won't be able to evade the obligations of holiness. Therefore, holiness is not a choice that Jerome can choose over Elisa or even for Elisa. It is an obligation for a saint, one who wants to be a saint, one who wants to enter heaven. So basically there is no choice. That is what Elisa represents here. And then he gets another reply after his 3rd letter. "My friend, do not imagine that I have made any resolution not to write to you. I merely no longer take any pleasure in writing, and yet your letters still interest me, but I reproach myself more and more for engrossing so much of your thoughts." Elisa's argument is that it is not that she doesn't want to write to Jerome, but she does not want to be an obstacle in Jerome's path to saintliness. And that is why she constantly reminds him of his duty to be a saint, and she wants to remove herself from his path. And that is why she doesn't want to write to him. So we see that gradually Elisa builds this huge obstacle towards continuing with the correspondence. So Elisa writes, "If you accept my proposal, that is, you come to Fanguzmar in summer and spend the time with me there. If you accept my proposal, then you do not write to me. By your silence, I will understand that you accepted it." So Jerome was in a kind of bind that if he replied to that letter, that would mean that he did not accept it. But he wanted to be with Elisa in summer, so he didn't write back to her, he didn't reply. So we see how this wall of silence was created between them. And we will see later that when Jerome actually goes to live with them for some time at Fanguzmar, we will see that Elisa would change so much, or deliberately she would change herself so much, that Jerome would not even enjoy his stay that much. he would be heartbroken, he would be disappointed. So here, in a kind of a confession, Jerome writes, "No, even then, Elisa, I did not accuse you, but wept despairingly that I could recognize you no longer. Now that I can gauge the strength of your love by the cunning of its silence and by its cruel workings, must I love you all the more agonizingly you bereft me?" So Jerome appears to be a noble lover. He never accuses Elisa for creating this wall between them. He still talks about the strength of her love for him and the test to which Elisa puts him again and again. Now this time, this silence, that is stopping correspondence, to Jerome it appears to be a test of his love. Whether his love is strong enough to be alive even after all these impediments. But obviously Jerome is fooling himself. These are not any tests designed by Elisa. Elisa herself is cheating herself, because as we know that she also had great desire for Jerome. She read too much of Johnsonist literature, too much of Pascal, and she wants Jerome to be a saint, and that is why she wants to remove herself from his path. So she is cheating herself, and unknowingly she is cheating Jerome also. If you feel like making any comment at any point, you can always do that. So Jerome did not know how to deal with it. Whether it was Elisa's disdain or she was cold to him, she convinced him that her love for him was very strong and very living. At the same time, her behavior towards him was just the opposite. So Jerome was extremely confused. As they meet at Fangusmar, Jerome finds that Elisa is very welcoming. Therefore, externally, Jerome cannot complain about anything. Never had she shown herself more cordial, more attentive. The first day I was almost taken in by it. What did it matter after all that she did her hair in a new way, which flattened it and dragged it back from her face, so that her features were harshened and their true expression altered. That an unbecoming dress, dull in color and ugly in texture, turned the delicate rhythm of her body to clumsiness. There was nothing here, I thought blindly, that might not be remedied the very next day. So Elisa dressed badly, did her hair badly, so that she appears unattractive and ugly. Yet she would be very welcoming, smiling towards Jerome. So Jerome thought that these minor changes in her dress, in her hairstyle, they are trivial things. They can be changed the very next day. But actually that was not the case. These changes in Elisa were not trivial. They were very serious. Because Elisa deliberately changed herself completely so that she would appear to be very unattractive and ugly, so that Jerome is not attracted towards her. Then he finds that the piano is missing. So Elisa has done away with music, art, high literature, all those things that Jerome loved. So this extreme piousness that appeared in Elisa, almost a kind of rudeness, peasant-like behavior, That was deliberately designed, deliberately constructed by Elisa. So when Jerome asked about the piano, then even her father said that it was not necessary to send the piano to be repaired right now. You could have kept it for a few more days so that as long as Jerome stayed, he could have enjoyed it. When you played it, it didn't sound so bad, said my uncle. To this, Elisa didn't have any answer, because she knew very well that it was her plot. She deliberately sent the piano before Jerome arrived for repair, so that when Jerome is there is no chance of music. All the things that Jerome loved, music, art, reading, literature, all those things won't be there, so that Jerome would lose all interest in her. The next day, Jerome finds that she is busy darning stockings. And this was very absorbing work, because darning is a very minute repair work that needs a lot of attention. She sat on the bench. Beside her was a great basket full of stockings and socks, into which she dipped. A few days later it was towels and sheets. This work absorbed her, it seemed, to such a pitch that every gleam of expression vanished from her lips and her eyes. So naturally Jerome is extremely bored. He loved to spend the time with Elisa by reading from literature or quoting from literature, reading poetry and so on. But Elisa didn't have almost any spare time left. She was all the time doing this darning work. He says, "Elisa, what is it?" said she. "I wanted to see if you would hear me. Your thoughts seem so far away from me." "No, they are here, but this darning requires a great deal of attention." So Jerome tells her that you could have employed maids, poor girls, for this darning work. You don't have to take it up yourself. You are not so poor that you have to economize by doing the darning work yourself. But then she told him that she liked no other kind of sewing so much. It was the only kind she had done for a long time past, and that she was doubtless out of practice for doing anything else. I am saying nothing but what is natural, her face seemed to declare. Why should it make you sad? So Jerome was extremely sad by this complete change in Elisa, and my whole heart's protest no longer even rose to my lips, it choked me. So he didn't know how to express his feeling of sadness as the way things turned out. But there was more for Jerome to discover when he looked at her bookshelf. He found that Elisa had removed all the books of poetry and literature which Jerome loved to read, and those books have been replaced by books written by unknown, insignificant, pious Christian authors. So the little collection of Elisa had been gradually formed partly by the books I had given her, partly by others which we had read together. I had just noticed that all these books had been removed and that they had been replaced exclusively by a number of insignificant little works of vulgar piety, for which I hoped she had nothing but contempt. Raising my eyes suddenly, I saw that Elisa was laughing. Yes, laughing as she watched me. So Elisa was kind of even enjoying Jerome's disappointment. "I beg your pardon," said she at once. "Your face made me laugh. It fell so abruptly when you saw my bookcase." "No, really, Elisa, is that what you read now?" "Yes, certainly." What is it surprise you? What is it surprises you? I should have thought that a mind accustomed to substantial food would have been disgusted by such sickly stuff. So these books were not literature. They were very inferior in their quality of writing. They are not works of art. I don't understand you, said she. These are humble souls who talk to me simply and express themselves as best they can. I take pleasure in their society. I know beforehand that they will not fall into any snare of language, fine language, and that I, as I read, shall not be tempted by any profane admiration. So this is the attitude that we find among English Puritans, that we find in the writings of even Anglican poets like George Herbert. Herbert has two poems where he writes about the importance of not employing too much rhetoric in poetry or too much of fine language in poetry. So Elisa gets this idea from Jansenist reading, because Jansenists are like English Puritans, and even though it is a sect of Catholicism, but they are like English Puritans. And the writers that Elisa loved, Racine, Pascal, these were also great Jansenist writers, and Elisa was influenced by them. So if you read Racine's play, you will see that his language is very simple. Yet Racine is able to create a kind of rhythm in his language, which is very surprising and very difficult to imitate. Do you read nothing but that then now? Almost. Yes, for the last few months. But I haven't time for reading now, and I confess that quite lately, when I tried to reread one of the great authors whom you had taught me to admire, I felt like the man in the scriptures who strives to add a cubit to his height. So this great author that Jerome had introduced to Elisa, and which Elisa now tried to reread and found unpalatable, which is not actually true, as we will learn later. This writer is Pascal, and particularly the book is Pensées or Thoughts. From the reading of her diaries, we will come to know that Elisa was highly influenced by Pascal and extremely attracted also towards his writings. But what he tells Jerome here, that is not true, if what we find in her diaries are true. So she presents an image of herself to Jerome that she wants Jerome to believe, but that is a false image. So Elisa was neither as pious as she appeared here to Jerome, because she felt a hunger for physical desire, nor was she reluctant to read Pascal or got any displeasure from reading Pascal. The complete opposite is true. The opposite is true. She liked Pascal too much, but she represents herself to Jerome in a very different way. Who is this great author who has given you such an odd opinion of yourself? He didn't give it me, but it was while reading him that I got it. It was Pascal. Perhaps I lighted on some passage that was not so good. So, by reading Pascal, Elisa says, she got a wrong idea of herself, and she found Pascal's writings to be too fine, and it led her away from the path of virtue. Therefore she would rather read insignificant writers on religion. I made an impatient movement. She spoke in a clear, monotonous voice, as if she were reciting a lesson, nor lifting her eyes from her flowers, which she went on arranging and rearranging interminably. She stopped for an instant at my movement and then continued in the same tone. Such surprising grandiloquence and such effort, and to prove so little. I wonder sometimes whether his pathetic intonation is not the result of doubt rather than of faith. The voice of perfect faith speaks with fewer tears, with fewer tremors. So in Pascal's writings there are a lot of emotions and highly charged, emotionally charged passages are there. Which to some extent we also find in George Herbert's poetry. Now you know that Herbert was an Anglican, and Anglicanism was a kind of officially Protestantism, but basically followed Roman Catholic practices. So we may think of the new kind of devotion that was sweeping Europe after Reformation, and which had a continuation in some countries, or in most countries, in among several writers, several authors, several religious leaders. That we can see in Pascal also. But this reproach for using rhetorical language, by a strange twist, that reproach is turned against Pascal, who himself is a highly praised author for expressing true religious emotion. Therefore, Alisa's criticism of Pascal, because of his grandiloquence, that is more or less unjustified. But even though Jerome had a superior taste, or we may say Jerome introduced Elisa to these great writers, so we see that Jerome here completely yielding to Elisa's critique of these writers. He is not objecting to these comments, he is not defending the great writers, he is not entering into any argument. So why does he totally accept or tend to accept anything that Elisa says? So we say that intellectually he does not exert himself. He is so much tied to Elisa by the emotion of love that he suppresses his intellectual judgment and never contests whatever Elisa tells him. It is just those very tremors, those very tears which make the beauty of his voice. I endeavor to retort, although dispiritedly. So Jerome knew where Elisa was wrong in her judgment of Pascal, but he could not carry on this defense in a spirited manner. For in her words I could recognize nothing of what I loved in Elisa. I write them down as I remembered them, and without any after addition of either art or logic. So Elisa appeared to him to be somebody very different. All the qualities of Elisa which Jerome loved, all those qualities had disappeared. So this debate about Pascal continues a little longer, but then we have seen that Jerome had no energy left to contest it. No matter, she answered, I wish it to remain uncertain, so that every suspicion of a bargain may be removed. The soul that loves God steeps itself in virtue out of natural nobility and not for the hope of reward. So about the uncertainty regarding salvation, Jerome asks her that, don't you believe that there is this uncertainty about salvation? Elisa says that I want it to remain uncertain, because when people strive for something without hoping for a reward, then it is a pure desire, pure love. And that is how one should strive for God or for the path of virtue, not for the hope of any reward. And that is the reason of this secret skepticism in which nobility such as Pascal find a refuge. So Jerome charges her finally with this question, that is it because of the fact that you want there to be uncertainty, that is why you are skeptical about Pascal and want to say that he does not find a place in your selection of authors, of noble authors. And to that Elisa replies, not skepticism, Jansenism, said she smiling. So what is the secret emotion or secret faith that is moving Elisa at this point? So Jerome thought that it was skepticism. She was skeptical about the way the qualities of Pascal's writing, or whether this kind of desire for salvation is acceptable in the eyes of God or not. But Elisa replied that it was not skepticism, but it was Jansenism. Therefore Gide makes it very clear for his readers which religious faith has completely taken over the heroine and in a way the hero also of the novel. It is Jansenism. What have I to do with such things? These poor souls, here she added, turning towards her books. Elisa apparently says that I reject Pascal for his Jansenism, but this is very strange. Actually she is influenced by Pascal for his Jansenism, but she says that I reject him for his Jansenism because I have no use for such high things. But the ordinary writers, they are much better because they do not proclaim any philosophy, any theory. They bow down before God like grass, like the grass which is bent by the wind, without guile or anxiety or beauty. They consider themselves of little account and know that their only value lies in their effacement before God. Elisa, I cried, why do you tear off your wings? So the suggestion is that Elisa was earlier an angel, but now she is cutting off her wings by rejecting beauty, nobility, art and all these things. Her voice remained so calm and natural that my exclamation seemed to me all the more absurdly emphatic. She smiled again and she shook her head. All that I brought away from my last visit to Pascal was what? I asked. This saying of Christ, whoever shall seek to save his life shall lose it. So you see that Elisa is even quoting Pascal, which means that she is highly influenced by his writings. But she won't accept it. So basically Elisa loves Pascal's language. And as for that, she went on, smiling still more and looking me steadily in the face, I really hardly understand him any longer. When one has lived any time in the society of such lowly ones as these, it is extraordinary how quickly the sublimity of the great leaves one breathless and exhausted. So a deliberate choice for lowly writers over highly specialized and writers of quality. One would call it a perversion of, but this reflects an extremist attitude, an extremist religious attitude which abjures art, which condemns art. And we know that from time to time in different religions such extremist attitudes appear. It appeared during the Protestant Reformation, in the iconoclasm of the Protestants. Opposition against art, the opposition against things of merit, things of quality, that becomes very popular among the mediocre, and it raises its head again and again in civilization. Jerome says that I would have never read these books that you are reading now. And Alicia says, if I were obliged, Alicia says, I should be very sorry to see you read them. I agree with you. I think you are meant for much better things than that. So you see, there is this contradiction. If Jerome is made for better things, which means things which are more artistic, of greater value, of greater quality, then how can Alicia propose that things of greater quality, things which are more artistic, should be rejected, and things of inferior quality should be, accepted in its place? There is this apparent contradiction which Alicia doesn't want to resolve, and Jerome cannot resolve, because at the heart of it there is some kind of a theatrical performance, because Alicia is play acting a role that she imagined would take Jerome further away from her. Therefore, there is some kind of a disingenuity, there is some kind of a, dishonesty involved in this. She spoke quite simply and without seeming to suspect that my heart might be rent by these words, which implied the separation of our lives. My head was burning. I should have liked to go on speaking. I should have liked to cry. Perhaps my tears would have vanquished her. But I remained without saying a word, my elbows on the mantelpiece, my head buried in my hands. She went on calmly arranging her flowers, seeing nothing or pretending to see nothing of my suffering. So here we have a clear testimony of Jerome's suffering. And Alicia knew that because of her behavior, Jerome was suffering, but she would not take cognizance of that. Now we cannot really go very deep into this, because if we try to do that, then mere analysis would spoil the quality of the thing, would spoil our appreciation of the quality of writing. Because Gide here is trying to bring into light the deep, cavernous, deeply buried emotions of people, all of which can never be explained, can never be interpreted. And he wants the readers to understand the contradictions which are there in the minds of people. Secondly, the complications which arise when people become influenced by certain ideology, certain philosophy, certain religion, certain politics, then in a way, when people are brainwashed, then they would believe something that they would not believe in ordinary circumstances. So the question of belief is very difficult to fully interpret or fully understand. So if you ask any hardliner, any extremist, why that person believes in what he believes. If somebody believes that by committing a murder of a number of people, that he would go to heaven and would have, 20 angels for his bride. If somebody believes that, what can you do? You are defenseless. Because this belief is not based on rationality. Therefore you cannot reason with him. So any kind of orthodox belief, or you may say fundamentalist belief, cannot be reasoned, cannot be explained. On the top of that, was Elisa totally brainwashed by Jansenism, was so much influenced by Jansenism that she behaved in this strange manner? Perhaps the answer is partly yes, partly true. But that is not the whole answer. Because much of what Elisa does is pretension. It is not that she has really become totally an extremist in religion, but she wants to appear in this fashion, whereas in reality she is something else. She wants to appear in this fashion because she wants to deceive Jerome, she wants to appear unattractive to Jerome, and Elisa does this with a good intention. The intention is that Jerome would become a saint. If Elisa deprives him of worldly love, you see that there is a proverb, the way to hell is paved with good intentions. So good intentions often lead to evil outcomes. Therefore, Elisa's case is complex. Do you have any questions or comments to make?
No further question.
So, Elisa says that we will carry on this conversation later, and this conversation was never taken up again in the future. And Jerome found that Elisa kept herself so much busy with all the small trivial duties that Jerome had to wait very long in order to speak to her or to meet her. So Jerome did not appear to be her priority at all, or was almost at the bottom of her priority. When Elisa granted me a few minutes, it was indeed for the most laborsome conversation, to which she lent herself as one does to playing with a child. She passed beside me swiftly, absent-minded and smiling, and I felt she had become more distant than if I had never known her. It even seemed to me sometimes that there was a kind of challenge in her smile, or at any rate a kind of irony, and that she took amusement in thus eluding my wishes. So Jerome was very disappointed, and the hope and expectation with which he had come to Fangusmar, believing that the wall of silence that grew between them was only because of physical separation, and Alisa did not want to continue the correspondence because that would not lead to the kind of happiness when they would meet. So if they had less correspondence, if they had less communication, then their meetings would be much more sweet. But this they imagined because of their experience of the last autumn, when even though they met, they could not even talk about their affair. And when this time they come, they meet, they stop their correspondence so that the meeting can be more living, more vivacious. But they find that this time also it is very disappointing. And why is it disappointing? We would say that mainly because of Alisa's changed attitude. Alisa changed herself, and she did that deliberately. So this would appear, or this may appear as a trial of Jerome. To Jerome perhaps it appears like this. The trials and tribulations of Jerome, he is being imagined as a future saint. But in a way this is pretentious, because Jerome is no saint. He has the normal physical desires and he wants the fulfillment of his love. Therefore, Gide here creates a situation where, because of some complicated emotions and purposes, this belief in heaven and the belief that heavenly love or love of God is superior to any worldly love, it creates a barrier between worldly lovers, and it leads to a negation of one kind of love for another kind of supposed love. A hierarchy in love based on religious ideas, which might also be called superstition at times, and which leads to a denial of happiness. Therefore, a morbid kind of faith, any faith that would lead to deprivation, denial, that would be morbid. For young lovers, not to enjoy their lives would be morbid. And Gide has portrayed this curious situation between these two lovers, Alisa and Jerome. Right, so I'll stop here and we'll have a break for 2-3 minutes, and then I'll be back.